Imagine this. A wealthy nobleman buys a child as a birthday present. Not a toy, not a horse, a human being. A young girl, brought not to a toy chest or a nursery, but to serve, to labor, to live as property. This was no ordinary gift, and this was no ordinary story. But the most shocking part is yet to come. The child he purchased was his own blood. Today we're going to explore one of the darkest corners of history, a moment so startling it sounds like fiction, yet it exposes a real and painful truth about how systems of power once treated human life as property. When we hear about slavery, we often think of distant fields and faraway plantations, but sometimes the cruelty was woven directly into family walls, with fathers and grandfathers making choices that blurred the line between kinship and ownership. In this video, you'll learn not just what happened, but why it happened within a world where people had no legal right to their own children. Slavery systems across history often stripped away basic human bonds. Slaves could be sold, gifted, or inherited, even as family hierarchies tried to maintain respectability. That meant children were heartbreakingly vulnerable to whatever choices the powerful decided to make. As we go deeper, you'll discover how in some societies owning slaves wasn't just accepted. It was celebrated as a sign of wealth and influence. Some wealthy families even gave enslaved children to their own children as gifts, teaching the next generation to see humans as assets rather than people. This wasn't an isolated or rare occurrence. Historical records show mothers and fathers giving enslaved girls or boys to their daughters as symbols of prestige or tools to learn ownership. But this story is different. This isn't about ownership alone. It's about twisted family dynamics, about a legacy built on injustice, and about how blurred the lines of humanity became in environments where laws valued property over people. You're going to see how the power structures of the past devalued love and instinct in favor of wealth and status. By the end of this video, you'll understand the forces that allowed and even encouraged such decisions. You'll see how wealth, entitlement, and the normalization of inhuman practices could warp moral boundaries. And you'll learn why remembering these stories matters today, not just as historical facts, but as warnings about how systems can shape actions, beliefs, and even definitions of family. So stay with me till the end, because this is more than a shocking tale. It is a lesson about how human worth was once calculated, and why we cannot ignore the echoes of that past. Today's history isn't just about names and dates. It's about understanding how people were seen, how they were valued, and how far society once strayed from basic humanity. Before we talk about individual stories or shocking events, we need to understand the system that made them possible. Slavery was not just a way to get labor, it was a way to turn human life into property. People were stripped of their identities, their families, and their rights. They became commodities, items to be measured, valued, bought, and sold. Humanity itself was secondary to the economic value assigned by their owners. Children were not spared from this dehumanization. Before we talk about childhood, understand that young boys and girls were treated just like tools or livestock. A child could be sold to pay a debt, to satisfy a whim, or as a gift to someone else. Their existence was tied to utility, not love or family bonds. Being small and dependent did not protect them, it made them easier to trade. Young lives were folded into the economy, and the bonds of blood were often meaningless in the face of ownership. Before we talk about consequences, notice how this affected families. Parents had no control over where their children went or who would claim them. Fathers, mothers, and siblings could be separated at any moment, and there was no legal recourse. The system treated the parent-child relationship as irrelevant, because it did not affect the property's value. Emotional ties were ignored, leaving heartbreak as a constant undercurrent in daily life. Before we talk about resistance, consider how this commodification influenced the culture around slavery. It created a world in which empathy and justice were overshadowed by profit and control. People internalized these norms, and generations grew up seeing humans as assets rather than as beings with rights and feelings. This mindset extended beyond plantations and homes. It shaped laws, trade practices, and social hierarchies. Before we talk about specific incidents of cruelty, recognize that this treatment was systematic. It wasn't occasional abuse, it was embedded in the very framework of society. Ownership meant total control, and total control demanded that the owned be objectified. Every action, from buying a newborn to assigning work in the fields, reinforced the idea that human lives could be catalogued, traded and exploited for gain. Before we talk about rebellion or escape, understand the psychological weight on both sides. Those enslaved lived under constant surveillance and threat, knowing that their existence was conditional and transactional. Those in power justified cruelty by normalizing the idea that people were commodities. Morality was overridden by economic logic, and innocence could be bought or sold without question. Before we talk about historical examples, it's clear that slavery reduced complex human beings to simple units of labor and profit. Children, adults, men, women, all were pieces in a system designed to maximize wealth, enforce hierarchy, and perpetuate control. It was a world where life itself could be measured in coins, contracts, and ownership. Before we talk about individual stories of cruelty, we need to understand the world in which they took place. This was a world dominated by aristocrats and wealthy landowners, people whose wealth was measured not only in land and gold, but in the lives of those they owned. Power was concentrated in the hands of a few, and with it came extreme control over others, control that could shape every moment of someone's life. Before we talk about specific acts of ownership, notice how society reinforced this hierarchy. Aristocrats were considered superior by birth, education, and wealth. Their status was untouchable, and laws were written to protect their privileges. Owning slaves was not just a choice, it was a marker of prestige. The more people you owned, the higher your social standing, and the more influence you could wield over your peers and the communities around you. Before we talk about daily life under these landowners, consider the power imbalance. Wealth allowed aristocrats to decide who lived where, who worked what hours, and who could access basic necessities. Entire communities existed at the mercy of these decisions. Families could be separated or forced to labor in harsh conditions, simply because an owner deemed it profitable or convenient. There was no recourse, no fairness, and often no empathy. Before we talk about inheritance and legacy, realize how ownership extended across generations. Slaves were considered property to be passed down, sold, or gifted. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically became the property of the master. This meant aristocrats controlled not just present labor but future generations, embedding their influence across time. Wealth became intertwined with human lives in ways that amplified power exponentially. Before we talk about personal choices and morality, notice how this system shaped behavior. The sense of absolute control encouraged cruelty, indulgence, and the normalization of violence. Owners could dictate lives without question, making rules that suited convenience and profit rather than fairness or humanity. The very structure of society reinforced that those with wealth had every right to assert authority over the powerless. Before we talk about resistance, consider how fear and dependency cemented this control. Slaves had limited options and lived under constant surveillance. Rebellion was dangerous, escape was risky, and compliance was often a survival mechanism. Wealth and power created not only control, but also a psychological dominance, conditioning people to accept their roles as property. Before we talk about broader consequences, recognize how this control extended beyond individual households. Landowners shaped local economies, influenced politics, and controlled resources. Their decisions affected entire regions. The labor of those they owned fueled wealth production and status, reinforcing the gap between the privileged and the enslaved. Before we talk about the human cost, it's clear that aristocrats and landowners wielded immense power. Their wealth allowed them to dominate lives completely, shaping communities, families, and destinies. In such a world, human rights were subordinate to property rights, and social hierarchies were rigidly maintained, ensuring that those at the top remained untouchable and unaccountable. Before we talk about the shocking act itself, we need to understand the mindset of the time. In certain societies, children were not always seen as innocent beings to be nurtured. Among the wealthy and powerful, they could be treated as property, much like furniture, livestock, or jewelry. This dehumanization was so deeply ingrained that buying a child as a gift was not considered immoral, it was considered acceptable. Before we talk about the specific case, consider how social norms shaped behavior. Owning slaves was a status symbol, and gifting one demonstrated wealth, generosity, and social influence. The idea of a child as a present was not rare among aristocrats and landowners. It was an extension of their understanding of power. The child's humanity was irrelevant in the face of the display of control and prestige. Before we talk about the Baron's choice, notice the selection process. Wealthy families would choose young children for their perceived usefulness, health and beauty. A young girl might be valued for her ability to serve in a household, assist with domestic tasks, or eventually be trained for labor that benefited the family. The child's personality or feelings were never considered. This was a cold calculation rooted in property and profit. Before we talk about the birthday gift itself, understand that giving a human being as a present reflects how normalized slavery had become. Ownership of humans was embedded in daily life, economy, and social relationships. To the Baron and his peers, there was nothing unusual about turning a child into a tangible symbol of generosity. What seems unimaginable to us today was ordinary within that historical framework. Before we talk about the implications for the child, it's important to realize how powerless she was. Unlike a toy, she had thoughts, feelings, and fears, but no legal protection or voice in her fate. She existed entirely at the discretion of her owner. Her life was treated as transferable, something to be handed over like a gift, regardless of her will or well-being. Before we talk about societal reinforcement, consider the message this act sent. Children of enslaved women were automatically considered property, families were irrelevant, bloodlines were ignored, and wealth dictated rights. By gifting a child, the Baron reinforced the idea that humans could be owned and traded, passing that normalization to his family and community. Before we talk about the broader cultural implications, notice the psychological effect on everyone involved. The giver demonstrated power and control, the recipient learned to see humans as possessions, and the child experienced complete dependency and vulnerability. This transaction maintained social hierarchies and ensured that the system of slavery remained unquestioned. Before we talk about consequences, it's clear that such acts reveal a deeply troubling aspect of history. When children could be bought as gifts, humanity was overshadowed by property rights, social expectations, and wealth. This normalization of ownership devalued life itself, shaping generations to see cruelty as acceptable and ordinary. Before we talk about legacy, we must acknowledge that the Baron's gift was more than a simple transaction. It was a reflection of an entire system built to treat humans as objects, where family ties, innocence, and individuality were subordinated to power and prestige. It shows just how far societal norms can warp morality and perception when human life is commodified. Before we talk about the shocking twist in this story, we need to understand the layers of complexity involved. This was not just the purchase of a child as property. The girl was not just any child. She was part of a family line that should have protected her, yet the very person responsible for her existence chose to treat her as a commodity. This fact alone changes the story from a simple transaction to a deeply troubling moral and historical case. Before we talk about historical lessons, consider what this tells us about the intersection of power, wealth, and gender. Women and children were especially vulnerable, as the patriarchal system allowed men to exploit them freely. Sexual abuse, exploitation, and the resulting generations of children could exist entirely under the authority of their abusers. The granddaughter's status as property reinforces the chilling extent of control aristocrats wielded over lives they had created themselves. Before we talk about the broader societal impact, recognize how ordinary this kind of situation could have been in that era. Aristocrats fathering children with enslaved women and then controlling the next generation was a pattern seen in many slaveholding societies. Yet each case, especially when it involved gifting or selling children, illustrates the profound moral failure of a system that prioritized wealth, status, and ownership above family and humanity. Before we talk about reflection, it becomes clear that the Baron's actions were not just cruel. They were emblematic of a larger systemic abuse. The fact that the girl was his granddaughter intensifies the tragedy, showing how slavery allowed people to exploit and dehumanize even their own blood, turning natural relationships into instruments of control and oppression. Before we talk about legacy, it's important to remember that stories like this challenge how we think about history. They reveal the extreme consequences of treating humans as property, and demonstrate the depths to which systems of power can warp morality. This child's life was defined not only by her lineage but by the cruelty and indifference of those who should have protected her. Before we talk about the shocking injustice of this story, we need to understand a harsh rule that defined the lives of enslaved people. The status of a child followed the status of the mother. Children born to enslaved women automatically became slaves themselves. This was not a matter of choice or circumstance. It was a law built to maintain control and ensure that wealth and labor continued to flow to the slave owners. No matter who the father was, or what family ties existed, the child was considered property first and a human being second. Before we talk about the Baron's daughter, notice the cruel irony of this system. Legally, she had no claim over her own child, even though the girl was her granddaughter, and even though the family connection should have given her some power or influence. The law and the culture of slavery stripped her of all authority. Blood relationships were meaningless in the face of property laws that prioritized ownership over family. This shows just how complete and systematic the dehumanization was. Before we talk about implications for the family, consider how these rules affected social relationships. Families were fragmented and loyalty was forced to bend to property rights. Mothers could see their children sold or given away. Fathers could have no say in their offspring's fate, and even the extended family had no power to protect the vulnerable. The Baron's daughter might have wanted to intervene, but society had removed all legal tools from her hands. Her grief and outrage would have counted for nothing against the established hierarchy. Before we talk about the children themselves, understand the consequences of this automatic inheritance of slavery. It created generations trapped by law, regardless of intelligence, talent, or morality. Being born to an enslaved mother meant the child would inherit not only the mother's status, but also her lack of rights and protections. In essence, slavery was perpetuated not just by force but by a rigid legal framework that ensured it could continue indefinitely. Before we talk about the moral dimension, notice how this law empowered the powerful and disempowered the weak. The Baron, as both grandfather and master, could exploit the girl without any legal repercussions. The system allowed him to turn his own family into property, revealing the extremes of cruelty that were not only tolerated but codified. Before we talk about resistance or exceptions, recognize that this automatic inheritance was designed to remove ambiguity. Slave owners did not want questions of kinship to interfere with their authority. By making the child automatically a slave, they eliminated any challenge to their control, ensuring that their wealth and labor supply remained secure. Before we talk about consequences for society, it's clear that these laws reshaped the meaning of family. Love, loyalty, and blood ties were secondary to ownership and economic benefit. Even the most intimate relationships could be overridden by the rules of property, creating a world where human connection was constantly at risk. Before we talk about the broader picture, remember that this principle ensured the continuity of the system. Each new generation of enslaved children reinforced the wealth and power of the landowners, while stripping humanity and autonomy from those born into bondage. In this way, slavery became self-perpetuating, and even family members of the owners were powerless to change the tragic outcomes for the children caught in the system. Before we talk about the shocking nature of this act, we need to understand the collision of family and ownership in the world of slavery. The Baron did something that seems unimaginable today. He bought his own granddaughter as property. This was not a mistake or a rare incident. It was a direct result of a system that treated humans as objects, where bloodlines could be ignored and family ties were subordinated to law and wealth. Before we talk about the implications for the child, notice how this act embodies the cruelty of the system. To the Baron, she was not a granddaughter to love or protect. She was an asset, a commodity whose value could be assessed in coins and labor. Her humanity, her connections, and her place in the family meant nothing compared to the economic and social norms that allowed her purchase. This collision of kinship and property created a reality where morality was secondary to law and status. Before we talk about societal consequences, consider the wider message sent by acts like this. By treating a family member as property, the Baron reinforced the idea that ownership trumped natural human bonds. Slavery normalized this dehumanization, showing that even intimate relationships could be overridden by control and profit. Children, parents, and extended family all became pawns in a system designed to maintain hierarchy and privilege. Before we talk about the moral weight, understand how psychologically damaging this was. The Baron's granddaughter existed in a world where the people who should have protected her were the same ones enforcing her subjugation. Family relationships, which in most societies offer safety and support, became instruments of oppression. This created an environment where identity and belonging were constantly undermined, replaced by fear, dependency, and uncertainty. Before we talk about historical patterns, notice that this was not an isolated phenomenon. Across societies that practiced slavery, it was common for enslaved children to be bought, sold, or gifted, even to relatives of the owner. Laws and customs prioritized property rights over family bonds, reinforcing cycles of control and exploitation. By examining this case, we can see how normalized cruelty became through legal and cultural reinforcement. Before we talk about long-term effects, consider the moral paradox for the Baron. He had fathered the girl's mother, creating a direct bloodline connection, yet that connection offered no protection. The system encouraged detachment and objectification, teaching those in power to value wealth and property over humanity. Family loyalty and natural affection were subordinated to ownership, demonstrating the extreme dehumanization embedded in society. Before we talk about lessons for today, recognize that this collision of family and ownership is a vivid illustration of slavery's brutality. It shows how systems can warp morality, allowing individuals to commit acts that would be unthinkable in any context that values human dignity. The Baron's actions highlight not just personal cruelty but the structural forces that enabled it. Before we talk about reflection, it is clear that the purchase of his own granddaughter exemplifies the dehumanizing nature of the system. It reduces humans to objects, erases bonds that define families, and prioritizes economic and social power above all else. In this way, one act can reveal the broader injustice of an entire society built on exploitation and control. Before we talk about specific cases, consider the experience of parents. Mothers and fathers had no legal control over their children. A parent could watch helplessly as a child was sold to another household, another region, or another owner entirely. The pain, fear, and heartbreak were constant realities. Legal codes gave no recourse or protection, and the authority of the slave owner overrode natural family bonds every time. Before we talk about the long-term impact, notice how this dehumanized entire generations. Children were not guaranteed to grow up with parents or siblings. Families were fragmented repeatedly, teaching young people that stability and safety were illusions. Family identity was constantly under threat, because even the closest relationships could be severed with a signature, a transaction, or a whim. Before we talk about personal tragedies, consider how even blood relations were disregarded. Fathers could be forced to labor far from their children. Siblings could grow up in different households, unaware of each other's existence. Mothers could see their daughters sold as gifts or laborers, powerless to intervene. The human need for connection was systematically stripped away to reinforce control and exploitation. Before we talk about emotional consequences, understand how this shaped identity. Children grew up in fear, mistrust, and confusion. Their understanding of family loyalty and love was constantly challenged. Every separation reinforced the idea that survival depended on obedience to ownership, not bonds of kinship or moral duty. Before we talk about resistance, recognize that these laws created both trauma and resilience. Families did everything they could to maintain connections, secret visits, messages, or simple memories, but the law and social norms worked against them. Even when love persisted, the legal system made it nearly impossible to keep families intact. Before we talk about reflection, it becomes clear that the disregard for family was not incidental, it was intentional. Slave laws were designed to ensure that enslaved people remained powerless. By stripping away the natural protections of family, the system maintained dominance, control, and economic benefit for the owners. Human relationships were sacrificed for profit, and the consequences lasted across generations. Before we talk about the broader historical lesson, it is evident that this disregard for family highlights the depth of cruelty in slavery. It shows a society structured to prioritize ownership over humanity, and it forces us to understand how law can be used to justify injustice and dehumanization on an unimaginable scale. Before we talk about how shocking this story feels to us today, it's important to step back and look at the society in which it happened. Audiences now instinctively recoil at the idea of a child being bought as a gift, or even more horrifying, a granddaughter being treated as property. Our modern sense of morality, empathy, and human rights makes it almost impossible to imagine. Yet for those living in that era, these practices were normalized, embedded in law, and socially accepted. What shocks us was routine for them. Before we talk about specific cases, consider the mindset of the time. Wealth, status, and power were measured by control over resources, including human lives. People were valued not for their individuality, feelings, or potential, but for the economic advantage they provided. Labor, obedience, and social connections determined a person's worth, and family ties or moral considerations were secondary, or ignored entirely. The humanity of an individual was replaced by a price tag, and the system rewarded those who could detach themselves from emotion in the pursuit of profit. Before we talk about the moral consequences, notice how widespread this thinking was. It wasn't limited to one baron, one household, or one region. Across societies with slavery, the ownership of humans was a marker of success, influence, and sophistication. To question it was not only unpopular, it could be dangerous. Laws, customs, and social expectations reinforced the idea that human beings could be bought, sold, or gifted, and that morality should bend to property rights and economic gain. Before we talk about emotional realities, think about the paradox for the enslaved. They were alive, aware, and capable of emotion, yet everything that defined their value to society was material. Their labor, their reproductive potential, their obedience, these were commodities. Even family connections could not save them. The system treated every person as replaceable, stripping them of individuality, agency, and dignity. Before we talk about historical patterns, reflect on the normalization of this thinking. People who lived in these times did not necessarily see themselves as cruel. They were products of a society that taught them to prioritize economic value over human life. Ethical frameworks were constructed around property, wealth, and status, allowing individuals to reconcile acts we now see as monstrous. Understanding this helps us see that cruelty can thrive, not just through overt malice, but through cultural and legal reinforcement. Before we talk about lessons for today, consider how this replacement of human worth with economic value shaped generations. Families were separated, children were sold, and even bloodlines were ignored. Entire communities learned to operate in a world where empathy was a weakness and compliance was survival. The moral cost was immense, yet it went largely unquestioned at the time. Before we talk about reflection, it becomes clear that our shock today highlights the progress in human understanding of rights and dignity. Yet history reminds us that what seems morally obvious now was once accepted as normal. It forces us to examine how social, legal, and economic systems can shape morality, often in ways that allow injustice to flourish under the guise of legitimacy. Before we talk about the broader implications, it is evident that this story is not only a window into cruelty, but also a lesson in human values. When societies replace human worth with economic value, the consequences are profound, affecting families, communities, and entire generations in ways that echo far beyond the immediate victims. A moment meant as a gift reveals humanity's darkest side. This story shows how deeply wrong systems can affect families and lives, turning love and blood ties into tools of control and exploitation. It forces us to confront the harsh realities of history, and reminds us how systems can shape morality, value, and human dignity. By reflecting on these events, we learn the importance of empathy, justice, and protecting the bonds that make us human. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most shocking and revealing moments.